Pope Leo XIV was sitting alone in his private chamber when the letter arrived from the father who abandoned him 63 years ago. No one knew what it said, no one saw the tears, but that letter changed everything. What began as a child's unanswered question turned into a journey of forgiveness that touched the heart of the church, and eventually the world. This is the story of a son who became pope, and the father who came back when no one thought it was possible. And if you think it's too late to forgive, or too far to return, you'll want to hear every word. Here's what happened. The golden light of early June bathed the Vatican in quiet stillness. That morning, it was June 3rd, exactly 26 days after the election of Pope Leo. The first 14th St. Peter's Square was already beginning to fill with pilgrims from every corner of the world. Their colorful banners fluttered in the breeze as families, priests, elderly couples, and wide-eyed children gathered for the Wednesday general audience, unaware that something far more personal than a papal blessing was unfolding. Just a few stories above them, inside the papal apartments, the morning routine was underway. Staff moved discreetly through marble corridors. Vestments were being steamed and pressed, and a silver crucifix gleamed on the table near the Pope's bedside. Yet despite the rhythm of the Vatican's rituals, something about this morning felt different, almost weighty. Pope Leo XIV, born Robert Francis Post, nearly 70 years ago in the suburbs of Chicago, stood alone at the window. In one hand, he held his reading glasses. The other rested on the back of a small wooden chair, where he had just prayed his morning rosary. His face carried the serene dignity of office, but his eyes betrayed a deeper current of emotion, distraction, and something almost like dread. On the edge of his desk, nearly out of place amidst neatly stacked papal documents, sat a single cream-colored envelope. It had arrived the day before with no special markings except one, a faint, worn postmark. Milano was delivered through ordinary diplomatic channels, as were dozens of letters each day, but this one had stopped his secretary in his tracks. The envelope bore no return name, only a tremulous, shaky script. Cardinal Joseph Torretti, his trusted Secretary of State, had brought it in personally. Your Holiness, the cardinal had said, voice low with unusual solemnity. This letter, it seems deeply personal. I thought you should see it immediately. Robert had taken the envelope silently as soon as his fingers touched the paper. He knew he hadn't seen the name in over 6 decades, yet it gripped his memory like a wound reopened. It was written by Louis Marius, Post's father. For a long time, he hadn't moved. The envelope sat like a stone in his hands, heavier than it should have been. Finally, he sat down, opened it with trembling fingers, and unfolded 3 handwritten pages. The ink was slightly smudged. The paper was plain. The words hit him before he fully read them. My son Robert, it began, if you are truly my son, and I know I have no right to say these words. I saw the news of your election on television, and I wept not from joy, but from shame. He stopped reading and closed his eyes. He was 7 again. He could see the old front door of their Chicago home swinging closed on October morning. In 1962, no warnings, no goodbyes, just silence, just absence. And that door, how does a man who abandoned his son ever claim pride? In who that boy became, the letter wrestled with that shame. You grew up without me. The letter continued, raised by your saintly mother Margaret and your grandmother Rose. They made you who you are. I fled because I was afraid I would become like my own father, afraid I would fail you, and so I failed by leaving. Tears now rolled freely down Robert's face. He made no effort to wipe them away. He read about how Louis had lived alone in a modest furniture workshop outside Milan. No other family, no remarriage, just a hollow echo of the boy he left behind. He had followed Robert's life from a distance, clipping every article, watching every televised milestone, priesthood, bishopric, cardinalship. And now, Pope, I don't ask for your forgiveness. The letter said, I know. Some wounds never heal. I only wanted you to know that. Not a single day has passed that I haven't thought of you. It ended with a return address and a final fragile plea. If your great shepherd's heart has room for an old man full of sorrow, I would be grateful to see you just once more. If not, I understand. I will respect your silence. The Pope pressed the pages to his chest. His heart acted not as a pontiff, but as a son. The tears returned, and still he didn't wipe them away. Cardinal Torretti re-entered the room some time later and found Robert sitting in absolute stillness, the letter clutched in his hand. For a moment he didn't speak. Then, using the cardinal's first name, a rarity, he asked, Joseph, how do we respond to someone who hurt us deeply, but who now asks sincerely to be forgiven? The cardinal walked closer, his voice calm and unwavering, as Christ taught us, your holiness, with mercy and with love. Robert nodded slowly and reached for a linen handkerchief tucked into his cassock. Arrange a visit to Milan. He said quiet, unannounced, no press, no security detail. Just a son going to see his father. But your holiness, Treddy began hesitating. Your schedule is full of the arrangements. There are moments, Joseph Robert interrupted gently. When God's timing matters more than ours, this man has waited 63 years. He will not wait one more day. That afternoon, a modest black car departed the Vatican. Inside sat Pope Leo, the first 14th, dressed not in white, but in a plain black suit and Roman collar. He watched the Italian countryside roll past his window, prayerful and quiet. Next to him, Cardinal Toretti remained respectfully silent. Finally, Robert spoke again. "You know, Yeppy," he said, his voice low, "for years I've told others to forgive. Thousands of times I've said in confessions and homilies and private counsel, and now God is asking me to live those very words." The cardinal looked at him with a deep admiration that needed no response, and as the car rolled steadily toward Milan, Pope Leo XIV did not feel like the head of the Catholic Church. He felt like a boy again, a son finally on his way to face the man whose absence had shaped his entire life. He didn't yet know what he would say. He only knew this what began as a letter might become a miracle, and somewhere in the quiet hills of northern Italy, father waited for the first knock on the door in over 60 years. "Thank you for staying with us and opening your heart to this journey. It means more than words. And say, as you listen, may your soul be uplifted, and your day filled with grace and peace from the Lord and our beloved Pope Leo Vortin." The next part of this story holds something truly special, and we can't wait to share it with you. If this message touches you, please subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and let us know you're walking this path with us. Your presence here is a true blessing. The car moved steadily along the winding roads of the Italian countryside, its dark windows reflecting the soft afternoon light. Inside, Pope Leo XIV sat in silence, dressed simply in a black cassock and Roman collar. Far from the regal white robes the world had come to associate with him, the papal insignia had been removed from the vehicle. There were no escorts, no security, convoys, no curious crowds. To everyone on the road that day was just another priest on his way to some quiet obligation. But in truth, Robert was on a journey unlike any other, a journey back to the broken origin of his life. He kept the letter tucked in the breast pocket of his coat, as if its nearness lent him strength. He had reread it so many times in the past day that he now knew certain phrases by heart. "I was afraid I would become like my own father. Not a day has passed that I haven't thought of you. If there is room in your shepherd heart outside the window fields of sunflowers waved under a warm breeze, a farmer walked beside a donkey-drawn cart. Children played soccer near a faded church wall. The landscape, though ordinary, shimmered with strange grace. Perhaps it was because Robert saw everything today through the lens of memory. Cardinal Toretti sat beside him, respectful and silent. He had served through diplomatic crises, theological debates, international conflicts. He had never seen the Pope like this, contemplative, small in his own presence, not because of weakness, but because something more human was moving within him. Finally, Robert spoke. He said, using the cardinal's given name again, "Do you remember the story of the prodigal son?" The cardinal nodded gently. "Of course, everyone remembers the son," Robert said, his eyes still fixed on the countryside. "The one who returns, the one who is welcomed. But I've often wondered about the walk the father must have made, the steps he took toward the boy when he saw him on the horizon. No sandals, no guards, no questions, just that long, trembling walk. He paused today. I'm taking that walk," he added softly. But in reverse, Joseph looked at him with quiet reverence. He wanted to speak, but held his tongue. "For all these years," Robert continued, "I've preached forgiveness. I've stood in the pulpit and told broken people that they must forgive their parents, their spouses, their children. I've said the words, bless them, in absolution. But I have never looked a man who broke me in the eyes, never asked God out loud to help me forgive him." The Pope turned now slowly to face the man beside him. Until now, Yeppy gave a small nod, his expression full of understanding. "For your holiness," he said, his voice low and even, "you are not walking alone." The car began its descent toward Milan. The road narrowed, bordered now by stone walls and flowering hedges. Small towns appeared like ancient brushstrokes against the hills. Bell towers pierced the sky. Each kilometer felt like another layer peeled back from the soul. Robert leaned his head back against the seat. His thoughts wandered not to the Vatican or the church or the endless issues on his desk, but to his 7th birthday, a cake with 7 blue candles, his mother singing softly in the kitchen, his father nowhere to be found. He remembered wondering back then what it was he had done wrong, why a boy like him could be left without a goodbye. The lie had taken root early, that maybe he wasn't enough, and yet now, decades later, the same man who had disappeared into silence had Written not to justify, not to excuse, but simply to say I was afraid. Robert reached into his pocket and unfolded the letter again. He read one line over. And over you became a man I always wished I could be, but never had the courage to become. That sentence struck something raw inside him. It wasn't only about absence anymore. It was about shame his father hadn't run. Because he didn't care he had run, because he thought he wasn't worthy. To stay it changed the shape of the wound. As they neared the outskirts of the city, Joseph finally spoke again. Are you certain, Your Holiness, that you want to do this without any formal arrangements? We could ensure privacy. We could control. But Robert raised his hand, not harshly, but with quiet finality, no ceremony. He said, no press, no protocols. I don't want this to be a papal visit to Zeep. I don't want it to be a performance. I want to be just a son knocking on the door of an old man, who once left the cardinal. Nodded slowly, and they drove on the lawn. Rose ahead of them in warm colors and quiet geometry. The city, old and dignified, bore no knowledge of what was coming as they pulled into a narrow street, lined with modest apartments. Buildings and small balconies overflowing with flowers. Robert felt his heartbeat in his throat. The address from the letter was on the third floor. No elevator, no grand entry. When the car came to a stop, Robert hesitated. He looked up at a window. A curtain shifted slightly, as if someone had just stepped away from it. He stepped out of the vehicle. The air smelled of rain and olive oil and worn stone. He wasn't the Pope anymore. He was just a man, a son. Each step toward the building made that reality stronger. He remembered the smell of his father's old coat, the sound of his laugh, before it disappeared from the house, the way he used to carry Robert on his shoulders, as if the boy was meant to see the world from above. He began to climb the stairs. Joseph followed silently behind. On each landing, a new wave of memories. Surface, some tender, some painful, but all real. At last they reached the door. The number was faded, the name on the door post. Robert raised his hand to knock. He paused, his fingers hovering just inches from the wood, then with a breath so deep it seemed to come from his soul. He knocked. No sound at first, then footsteps, then the latch, and the door opened. A man stood there, frail, gray, his body bent with age, but the eyes were unmistakable, deep blue, the same eyes Robert had seen in the mirror every day of his life. They stared at each other, no words, then the man whispered, Robert. The Pope, the son, stepped forward and whispered back, Papa. And in that breathless space between their words, something eternal stirred, something lost began to return. Thank you for staying with us and opening your heart to this journey. It means more than words can say. As you listen, may your soul be uplifted, and your day filled with grace and peace from the Lord and our beloved Pope Leo XIV. The next part of this story holds something truly special, and we can't wait to share it with you. If this message touches you, please subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and let us know you're walking this path with us. Your presence here is a true blessing. He didn't remember crossing the threshold one moment. Robert stood in the hallway face to face with the man whose absence had shaped his entire life. The next, he was inside a small, dimly lit apartment that smelled faintly of old with coffee and something else he couldn't place. Maybe time itself. The walls were lined with shelves cluttered with books, picture frames, and newspaper clippings yellowed with age but preserved like relics. A modest crucifix hung above a simple wooden table, and beside a sunlit window stood two worn armchairs, their cushions sagging from use. Thomas, though Robert still couldn't quite bring himself to use the name aloud, closed the door behind them softly. The click of the latch seemed louder than it should have been, final, yet fragile, like the sound of something long dormant returning to life. He looked older than Robert had imagined, thinner, frielier, a man hollowed out by decades of silence, but the eyes, those eyes still held something, as if inside them lived a boy who never stopped hoping for a second chance. You look, Thomas began, then stopped, his voice cracked like dry. Would you look like your mother? Robert smiled faintly and gestured toward the armchair she always said, I had your eyes. They both sat, facing one another, the table between them. For a long moment, neither spoke. Outside, the sound of the city drifted through the open window. A bus sighing at a stop, a child laughing in the courtyard below, a distant bell tower marking the hour. Thomas folded his hands in his lap and exhaled slowly. I didn't think you'd come. I didn't think you'd write, Robert replied, the older man's eyes lowered, staring at his hands. I almost didn't. I wrote a dozen versions of that letter, threw them all away, thought it was too late, that I had no right. You didn't, Robert said quietly. Not then. Thomas flinched slightly. But now that I know, but you do now. Robert added softly. The air between them felt charged not with anger, but with something deeper. Years of words, unsaid questions, unasked pain. Carried in silence, Robert leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Why did you leave? Thomas's breath caught. He blinked, stared out the window, then back at his son. I've asked myself that question for 63 years. He said, and every answer feels like a failure. Try anyway, Robert said gently. Thomas looked at the floor, his voice a whisper. I lost my job. Your mother was working 2 shifts. I was drinking too much. I looked at you so bright, so full life. And I thought he doesn't need a broken man like me. I kept telling myself, you'd be better off, Robert. Clenched his hands together. But you didn't even say goodbye. You didn't send a card. You just vanished. I was a coward. Thomas said the words almost inaudible. I thought if I disappeared, it would hurt less for you. I told myself I'd come back when I became the man I was supposed to be, but the longer I stayed away, the more ashamed I became. And then I saw you becoming everything I wasn't. You watched? Robert asked, almost startled. Thomas nodded. Every step, I saw your ordination. In a factory break room on a black and white TV, saw your first mask clipped every article. I have them all. He gestured toward the small cabinet beside the bookshelf. Robert stood and walked slowly to the cabinet. He opened it and found a stack of old newspapers and photographs there. He was beaming at age 22 in a group photo from seminary, his first Christmas, homily his elevation. To bishop the day, he stepped onto the balcony. As Pope, you kept everything, he said, voice trembling. I couldn't be there, Thomas said, so I kept what I could. Robert turned and looked at him. The man, sitting in the chair, looked like a shadow of the father he remembered, yet somehow more real than ever before. I used to wonder, Robert said quietly, if you ever thought about me, if I was just a chapter you closed. Thomas shook his head, eyes glistening. Every birthday, every Christmas, every time I heard the name Robert, you were never gone for me to wave it. All threatened to crush the silence. But neither man looked away. Then Robert asked a question that had haunted him since he was a child. Did you love me? Thomas didn't hesitate. With everything I have but love, love doesn't always make us brave. Sometimes it terrifies us. I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I didn't think I deserved to. Robert sat down again. You didn't, he said, then added, but neither did I deserve to grow up wondering if I was worth staying for. Thomas nodded slowly. I know, and I am sorry. I've carried that sorrow for a lifetime. The room was quiet again, but this time the silence wasn't suffocating. It was spacious, like a cathedral of grace being slowly rebuilt between them. I prayed for you, Robert said. Every night since I was 7, I didn't know if you were alive or dead, but I prayed. Thomas covered his face with his hands, and for the first time he wept openly. His shoulders trembled, his breath hitched. He was no longer the stoic figure from a child's memory. He was just a man, broken and humble, finally released from the prison of silence. I don't deserve to be sitting across from you, he sobbed. Robert reached into his coat and pulled out the letter. He unfolded it slowly and read aloud the final lines. If your great shepherd's heart has room for an old man full of sorrow, I would be grateful to see you just once more. He lowered the paper. That wound never fully healed, but it's still alive, and that means it can still feel, which means it can still forgive. Thomas looked up, tears still shining in his eyes. You're saying you forgive me? Robert didn't answer right away. He stood and walked to the window, looking down at the children play in the courtyard. Then, after a long pause, he turned. I'm saying I'm trying. He said, forgiveness isn't a door you walk through. Once it's a path, and I'm willing to walk it with you if you are. Thomas stood slowly, nodding. More than anything, they faced each other, not Pope and penitent, not leader and sinner, but father and son, broken, scarred, and finally honest. Robert opened his arms. Thomas didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and collapsed into the embrace he had waited for all his life. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry. And in that long-awaited embrace, something sacred took root, not a perfect ending, but a beginning, a second embrace. The morning after their reunion, the sun rose gently over the Milan suburb, casting a soft golden light across the buildings. Robert stood by the window of his modest guest room, a borrowed space in his father's apartment. The streets below were quiet. A few bicycles rattled by a baker arranged loaves in his storefront. It was an ordinary scene, but to Robert it felt extraordinary. He was still trying to absorb what had happened the night before the knock. The door opening to embrace a lifetime of silence had unraveled in a matter of hours. His father moved slowly around the kitchen, preparing 2 cups of coffee with careful hands. He looked smaller in the morning light, stooped with age, his movements fragile but deliberate, yet there was a new steadiness in the air between them. No longer strangers, no longer ghosts. There was now a shared breath, a fragile thread of belonging that had not snapped in the night. Do you take sugar? Thomas asked, holding up a bowl. Black is fine, Robert said with a smile. They sat at the small kitchen table, the cups between them steaming gently. A few seconds passed in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. There was something sacred about that quiet, the kind of silence that no longer needed to fill itself with words. I didn't sleep much, Thomas admitted. Neither did I. I kept thinking it was a dream. Robert looked down into his coffee. It wasn't. Thomas nodded and smiled faintly. I'm glad. After moment Robert lifted his eyes. Come to Rome with me. The older man froze the cup, paused halfway to his lips. To Rome? To the Vatican. Robert said, just for a few days. As my guest. Thomas set the cup down gently. Your guest, I'm not sure I belong there. You're my father. Robert said firmly, that's all the belonging you need, but the press, the security, the attention. There won't be any. Robert interrupted. I want to be quiet, private. No one will know except a few who must know ceremony, no speeches. Just you and me. Thomas blinked. You'd really have me there in your world. It's not a world I want to keep from you any more. Thomas took a long breath, his hands trembling slightly. I don't know what to say. Robert reached across the table and placed his hand gently over his father's. Say, yes. Thomas nodded slowly. Yes, that afternoon arrangements were made quietly. Simple car, a discreet driver, and Cardinal Toretti, who arrived by train to escort them back. When Robert stepped into the car beside his father, dressed once again in his plain black cassock, he looked nothing like the Pontiff seen by millions. He looked like a son, humble, peaceful, and deeply resolved. To ride south was long, but unhurried. The countryside unfolded in silence, rolling hills dotted with cypress trees, vineyards sparkling under the sun, olive groves stretching into the distance. Neither man spoke for the first hour. There was no need. They had found a rhythm in their quiet, a kind of communion that had nothing to do with words. Eventually Thomas spoke, his voice low. I don't know how to be a father now, not at this stage. Robert turned to him, smiling softly. You don't have to be anything. Just be you. I'm not asking for man, you or I. Just want to know the man. You are. Thomas nodded. Swallowing hard, it feels like I miss your whole life. You did. Robert said honestly. But that doesn't mean you have to miss what's left. They passed through small villages and towns where old men sat on benches playing chess, and children ran through fountains. At one point, they passed a family walking along a narrow dirt path. A father with two young sons. The boys were laughing, chasing each other with sticks, while the father trailed behind, smiling. Thomas watched the scene with quiet intensity. One used to imagine walking you to school. He said, I wondered if you were quiet or full of questions. I wondered what made you laugh. I was curious, Robert said, especially about you. Thomas's eyes flicked toward him, full of surprise. What did they tell you, your mother, your grandmother, that you left, that you had your reasons? They never spoke badly of you, but they never answered all the questions either. I had to fill in the blanks myself. I don't deserve their kindness. Thomas murmured, sometimes mercy doesn't wait for us to deserve it. Robert said, sometimes it just appears and asks to be received. Another long stretch of silence passed, but it was thick with grace. The road narrowed, traffic thickened, signs appeared with familiar names. Rome was near. I don't want anyone to know who I am. Thomas said suddenly, not the guards, not the cooks, no one. They won't. Robert promised, for you're not coming as a guest of the holy. See, you're coming as my father. That's all. When they finally entered the gates of Vatican City, the car wound quietly through the shaded inner roads, bypassing the public entrances and cameras. They arrived at a private door near the gardens where a small team waited. No one asked questions. No one took photos. They simply nodded, bowed slightly, and stepped aside as Thomas stepped onto the ancient stone path leading to the Vatican gardens. He stopped to take it all in. The flowers, the olive trees, the quiet fountains. It was more peaceful than he imagined. No splendor, no intimidation, just beauty, humility. And peace, this is where I walk in the mornings, Robert said, as a stroll where I talk to God, and now I get to walk it with you. Thomas replied. Robert smiled. For as long as God allows. They reached the papal residence and entered through a modest side entrance. The staff, all informed, remained discreet. Inside, Thomas was shown to a simple guest room overlooking a courtyard. Roses, a fresh set of clothes, had been laid out. A note on the nightstand written in Robert's hand read, rest tonight. Tomorrow I'll show you where I pray, where I live, not what I built, but what God has done. Thomas read it twice, then a third time. He sat by the window, hands folded, looking out over the ancient walls of a city that had never felt closer. He wasn't just visiting the Vatican. He was walking back into his son's life step by quiet step. The next morning unfolded like a prayer whispered before dawn. A faint mist lingered above the Vatican gardens, softening the shapes of ancient olive trees and marble statues. Birds moved gently between the branches, their songs faint, reverent in this holy stillness. Two men walked side by side, one in a simple cassock, the other in a dark cardigan, and slacks his steps slower, steadier than the day before. It had been years since they'd walked together, decades since their last conversation. But now in the sacred place, they were not pope and visitor. They were father and son. Robert led his father down a quiet path shaded by cypress trees. This is where I come when I need to be silent, he said, when the weight here's too heavy, when the world is loud. Thomas Looked around with awe. It's so peaceful, not all what I imagined. That's because it has to be, Robert said without silence. I forget who I really am. Thomas smiled faintly. And who are you? Robert stopped walking. He turned to face him. I'm still the boy who wondered why his father never came home. Thomas lowered his head. But I'm also the man who came here every morning, Robert continued, and laid that ache at God's feet again, and again they resumed walking there. Steps slow, thoughtful. Do you pray here? Thomas asked. Every morning, Robert replied. Before anything else, they came to a small stone bench under a fig tree. Robert gestured for his father to sit. They settled into the silence together, the fig leaves casting dappled shadows over their faces. I want to tell you my story, Thomas said after a long pause, the part you never heard. Robert nodded. I stayed in Milan. Thomas began work in a small furniture workshop, built tables, chairs, altars for village churches. I lived in a tiny flat, quiet, simple, lonely. I didn't marry again. I could. Why? Robert asked gently. Because no one else would have made me forget what I left behind, Thomas said. And I didn't want to forget. He glanced sideways. I had a shoebox under my bed full of newspaper clippings. Every time your name appeared when you became a priest, a bishop, a cardinal, I'd cut it out and save it. I used to sit on the edge of my bed and look through them, wondering what kind of man you had become. Robert looked at him with something like wonder. I never knew. Thomas nodded. I watched your life happen from a distance, and I hated myself for not being part of it. You still reach me, Robert said. I did. You reach me in the silences, in the unanswered questions, in the longing. Your absence made me look for a father who would never leave. Thomas closed his eyes. I'm sorry I was that. Absence, I know, Robert said. Thomas took a breath, heavy and slow. I always imagined you surrounded by bishops and cameras and guards. But this garden, this bench, it's so human. That's why I brought you here, Robert said. I wanted you to see that I'm not just a public figure. I'm still your son. I didn't think I'd ever hear that. There again, Thomas whispered. Robert reached into his cassock and pulled out something small, worn with smooth by years of prayer. A rosary. This was mine, he said, from seminary. From the night before I was ordained and the night before I read your letter. Thomas took it with trembling hands. Are you sure? Yes, Robert replied. It's traveled many miles. It's time it returned to you. Thomas closed his fingers around it for a moment. He couldn't speak. I have nothing to offer you now, he said finally. No wisdom, no legacy, just this broken, repentant heart. That's exactly what God uses, Robert replied. Not perfection, just availability. They sat in silence again. Around them the world moved. Gently a gardener passed at a distance, careful not to disturb the Vatican walls, stood like ancient guardians holding the moment still. Thomas turned to his son. You've never told the world about me. Why? Because healing isn't always for public view, Robert said. Some wounds mend better in quiet places. Thomas nodded understanding. But maybe on E-Day, Robert added. Others will need to hear this story, not for me, but for them. Thomas looked away, eyes misting. I don't deserve you. No one deserves grace. Robert said, that's why it's grace. The fig leaves rustled above them. A small breeze passed, cool and fragrant. Robert stood slowly. There's more I want to show you, he said, but first let's walk a little more. They rose together and moved along the path past statues of saints, flowering shrubs, and a small fountain trickling into a stone basin. At one point, they passed a statue of St. Joseph, cradling the child Jesus. Thomas paused. I used to think Joseph was just background, he said. Robert tilted his head. And now I think he was the bravest of all. Thomas said. He stayed. They stood together in front of the statue, watching the father carved in stone hold the son who would save the world. I couldn't be Joseph, Thomas said, but I want to try now in what time I have left. Robert placed a hand on his father's shoulder. We'll walk this together. And as they continued forward step by quiet step, the air around them felt lighter, as if some ancient sorrow had finally loosed its grip. The garden, once silent, now seemed to sing. It wasn't the kind of joy that shouted. It was a quiet kind that grows from forgiveness, watered by tears, blooming in places once thought barren. By the time they returned to the residence, the morning light had turned to late day gold, but neither man was in a hurry. They had lost 63 years, but they were learning how to walk again. Together the morning sun cast long golden beams across St. Peter's Square. Thousands of chairs lined the great expanse in perfect rows, already half filled with pilgrims who had arrived before dawn. Some clutched rosaries, others waved small flags, whispered prayers, or stared in quiet, or at the balcony where Pope Leo XIV would soon appear. It was a typical Wednesday general audience in many ways, but those close to the Holy Father knew that today would be anything but ordinary. In a quiet room inside the Apostolic Palace, Robert stood before a mirror, fastening the white sash around his cassock. His hands moved steadily, but his heart was not calm. Not today. He was about to lay bare something he had carried his whole life. Today, he would not speak as the vicar of Christ, but as a son who had suffered, and as a man who had forgiven behind him. Thomas stood in silence, dressed in a simple black suit. He had trimmed his white hair, shaved with care, and though his hands trembled slightly, his back was straight. He had asked his son 3 times that morning if he was sure. Each time Robert had answered, "I am, are you?" And Thomas had nodded, not because he felt ready, but because he trusted the one inviting him into the light. "You don't have to speak," Robert said one last time as they walked toward the side corridor leading to the viewing area. "Just be beside me. That's enough. I'll be there," Thomas said softly, "even if my knees shake." When the Holy Father stepped onto the balcony, the square erupted, flags waved, applause echoed off the colonnade. Some pilgrims stood with tears already in their eyes, simply to see him. He raised his hand in blessing, smiled gently, and greeted the faithful in Italian, French, Spanish. And English. His voice was clear, but there was a new texture to it, like something sacred pressing behind each word. After acknowledging the various delegations and visitors, he paused. The crowd quieted, as if sensing something was coming. "My dear brothers and sisters," Robert began, "today I wish to speak not only as your shepherd, but as a son." The silence in the square deepened. Even the pigeons seemed to hush this week. He continued, "Something extraordinary happened, something personal, but something I believe speaks to the heart of the gospel." He looked out over the crowd in the front row of the Tribune of Honor. Seated quietly beside Cardinal Torretti was Thomas. His hands were folded in his lap, his eyes focused not on the sea of people, but on his son 63 years ago. Robert said, "My father left. I was 7. There was no explanation, just absence. I carried that silence into my priesthood, into my prayers, into every room I entered for decades. I lived without his voice." A murmur swept through the square, not of scandal, but of human recognition. Then just days ago, I received a letter of the Pope, continued from him, not full of excuses, just truth, not filled with pride, but sorrow. He let the words hang for a moment. I traveled to Milan. We sat across from each other for the first time since I was a child. We cried. We spoke words that had waited a lifetime to be spoken. And I forgave him not because it was easy, but because mercy is greater than time. Tears fill more than one face in the crowd. "He is here with me today," Robert said, "not because he is perfect, but because he had the courage to return, to ask for nothing but to be seen." He turned slightly toward the side corridor. "My father is here," he repeated, "and I have invited him to stand beside me." Behind the curtain, Thomas stood frozen. His hands clutched each other tightly, his breath shallow. He felt the pull of old shame, the weight of eyes. He could not see, but then he felt a hand on his back. Cardinal Torretti leaned close and whispered, "Go, he's waiting." Thomas stepped forward. When the crowd saw him, an old man, modestly dressed, eyes filled with tears, a stillness swept across the square, deeper than any applause. For a moment, it was as if time paused. Robert extended his arms. Thomas walked slowly, carefully, and entered, embraced. The square erupted, not in noise, but in emotion. Some stood, some fell to their knees, others simply bowed their heads and wept, because in that embrace they saw themselves, their own fathers, their own sons, their regrets there. Hopes. Robert turned back to the microphone. "This man," he said, "left me when I was a boy, but today I say to him before the world, I forgive you, not with bitterness, but with love, and I thank you for returning." Thomas did not speak. He simply held on to his son. His knees shook, but he did not fall. What echoed to the square was not just applause. It was something sacred. It was mercy made visible that afternoon back inside the papal apartment. Father and son sat once again in silence, but this silence was different. It held peace. "You were brave today," Robert said, breaking quiet. Thomas shook his head slowly. "No, I was forgiven today, and that gave me the courage." Robert nodded. "That's what the world saw." "Do you think they understood?" Thomas asked. "I think they saw what mercy looks like," Robert replied, "and I think that's enough." As the sun began to set behind St. Peter's dome, the 2 men stood at the window below. The last of the pilgrims left the square. But something had changed there forever, not in architecture, but in the hearts of those who witnessed a second embrace. And within those heart seeds had been planted seeds that would grow into letters, phone calls, reconciliations, into hope, into grace, and into homecomings not yet written but now possible. Thank you for staying with us and opening your heart to this journey. It means more than words can say. As you listen, may your soul be uplifted, and your day filled with grace and peace from the Lord and our beloved Pope Leo XIV. The next part of this story holds something truly special, and we can't wait to share it with you. If this message touches you, please subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and let us know you're walking this path with us, your presence here. Is a true blessing the day after the embrace in St. Peter's Square. The Vatican was unusually quiet, not out of psalmody, but reverence the papal staff moved with gentler steps. Priests pause longer before the blessed sacrament. Even the Swiss guards, usually stoic, share quiet nods with one another, as if something unspeakable had passed through the air, leaving behind a sacred stillness. Everyone who had witnessed what happened knew they had seen something holy, not because it was wrapped in doctrine or dressed in liturgical garb, but because it was real. Inside his private study, Pope Leo XV sat with a tall stack of unopened letters beside him. They had begun arriving the same evening. The crowd dispersed, hundreds by nightfall, thousands by morning. Not messages from dignitaries or bishops. These came from ordinary people, from mothers estranged from sons, from fathers broken by years of silence, from children still carrying questions that had no words. Robert reached for the first envelope. The handwriting was uneven, the ink smudged inside. Was a single sheet written in Spanish. It was from a grandmother in Argentina who had not spoken to her daughter in 16 years. I watched you and your father. The letter read, I cried, not because I saw a pope, but because I saw a door open I didn't know it could still open. The next letter was from a man in Ohio, widowed, whose only son hadn't spoken to him since his wife's funeral. Your Holiness, I stood in my kitchen and wept when you said, I forgive you. I couldn't remember the last time I said those words out loud. I called my son last night. We spoke for 7 minutes. It was the most I breathed in years. Robert closed his eyes, holding the letter to his chest. He hadn't set out to start anything. He had simply gone to see his father. But now he saw the ripples the way grace moves when it is not restrained by shame or image. It doesn't whisper, it spreads later. That day, he met with Cardinal Torretti in the papal library. The cardinal placed a new stack of letters on the table, then sat across from him. We're getting over 10,000 a day, he said. From every continent, many from people who haven't been to church in decades. Are not writing to the church, Robert said quietly. They're writing to mercy. Torretti nodded, but his voice carried weight. Your Holiness, something is happening. We need to consider what to do with it, how to guide it. This is more than a moment. It may be a movement. Robert stood and walked to the tall window that overlooked the square. He didn't speak for a while. Then he turned. Let's begin something new, not a document, not a policy, a mission rooted in reconciliation, not for politics, not for public image, but for the human heart. I want us to go where the pain lives. Torretti raised an eyebrow. What would we call it? Robert thought for a moment, then he smiled softly. The Fratelli mission. He said a mission of brothers for families, for forgiveness. That evening, he called his father, who had returned. To his guest quarters, Thomas was sitting at a small table. A cup of tea in front of him, the rosary Robert had given him wrapped around his hand. Papa, Robert said, they're writing, thousands of them, not to the Vatican, to you, to me, to their fathers, their sons. Thomas's voice cracked. I never imagined the world would care about one broken man. They don't, Robert replied. They care about hope, and you gave them that. In the following days, Thomas began receiving letters of his own. The Vatican had established a small desk just to help process them. Each one came handwritten, many in pencil or with shaky cursive. Some were just a sentence. Others were pages long. I'm sorry. I never came back. I watched your face. And I thought of my daughter. I want change, but I don't know how one letter from a man in South Africa read. I haven't spoken to my father since I was 16. When I saw your face trembling beside your son, I dropped my pride. I called him. We are meeting for coffee next week. I don't know what to say, but I'll show up. Because you did. Thomas read each letter slowly, carefully. He didn't rush. He didn't skim. He prayed over each one, whispering names out loud. Even if he didn't know the people behind them, he wrote replies by hand, simple ones. Thank you. You are not alone. Keep walking. He began to visit the small chapel near the Vatican gardens. Each evening, lighting a candle for the people who had written. Even if he never knew their names, he would sit in silence, the rosary in his lap, and repeat the same prayer, Lord, let them come home. And they did. In Brazil, a bishop began holding nights of mercy, where families gathered simply to pray for forgiveness. In South Korea, a seminarian reached out to the father he hadn't seen in 10 years, writing only one line, if the Pope can, so can we. In a prison in Colombia, inmates requested the video of the Pope's embrace to be played during their Sunday Mass. Many wept openly. None of this had been planned, none of it strategized. But grace does not need a blueprint. One afternoon, Cardinal Torretti returned with a folder of press clippings and asked, what should we do about all this attention? Robert looked up from the letter and said, we don't do anything. We receive it like we receive each other, humbly, quietly. But then he paused and added, I want to share a few of their letters anonymously, no names, just their pain, just their healing. Let others see that mercy doesn't only live in cathedrals, it walks in kitchens. and on sidewalks, and in letters mailed by trembling hands. They began a small bulletin called Letters of Mercy. Each week one story was shared, just one: a father asking forgiveness, a son reaching back, a woman forgiving a mother who left no commentary, just a letter, and the world leaned in to read. And so it spread, not like fire, but like light at dawn, quiet, unstoppable. One man forgave, another returned, and the world, stunned by mercy, began to remember what grace can do. The morning light settled over Vatican City. Like a benediction, the sun was soft, filtered by clouds that drifted lazily across the Roman sky. But within the Vatican gardens, something rare was taking place. The gates were open, not for dignitaries or photographers, not for tourists with maps and cameras, but for families, for the broken, for the waiting, for the wounded. It was the first World Day of Reconciliation, a quiet gathering born not from committees or policies, but from one father's return and a son's embrace. From all over the world, there came a mother from Argentina who hadn't spoken to her daughter in 15 years, a young man from Germany who had never met his birth father, but wanted to pray for him, a priest from Rwanda whose father had disowned him for choosing the church. No one wore badges, there were no name tags. Only hearts beating with longing. Small wooden confessionals had been placed beneath the olive trees nearby. A tent offered writing paper and envelopes for those who needed to say what they had never dared. A stone path had been lined with candles leading to a central fountain where a crucifix had been quietly set on a pedestal. The water sparkled in the light. It wasn't ceremonial. It was sacred. Thomas Prevost arrived through the garden side gate. Escorted by Cardinal Toretti, he walked slowly but with steady steps, his eyes taking in the beauty of the moment. He was dressed in a modest navy suit, a small wooden cross hanging from a cord around his neck, a gift from a group of fathers he now met with weekly, the Padre Ferretti. He had practiced his words, written them out, folded and unfolded the paper more times Ethan he could count, but today he wasn't speaking as a performer. He was speaking as a man who had once vanished and dared come back. As the crowd gathered near the platform, a simple wooden stage set in the heart of the garden, a hush fell over the people. There was no fanfare, no grand music, just stillness. The event opened with a brief prayer from a bishop from South Korea, followed by a children's choir from Brazil, singing about the prodigal son. A Franciscan friar from Rwanda spoke briefly about reconciliation after war. And then the name was spoken, Thomas Prevost. There was no applause, only reverence. Thomas stepped forward, the folded page trembling in his hand. He reached the podium, looked out at the sea of faces, some smiling, some crying, some blank with waiting, and then did something no one expected. He placed the paper gently on the stand and looked up. I had a speech, he said. His voice was steady, weathered by age and grace, but I've decided not to read it. He took a breath. My name is Thomas. I am a father. And I made mistakes that nearly cost me everything. A breeze moved through the garden, rustling the fig leaves overhead. I abandoned my son. When he was 7, I left, not because I didn't love him, but because I was afraid. I told myself he'd be better without me, that I had nothing to offer. And for over 60 years, I lived in silence. I convinced myself it was too late. He paused, his voice catching, but mercy, he said slowly, doesn't care about clocks. It doesn't wait for qualifications. It only asks, are you willing to come home? Many in the crowd wiped their eyes. I came home, he continued, and my son, the one I left, the one I feared would never forgive me, opened his arms. He let me walk into his life, and in that moment, I found something I thought I had forfeited forever, hope. He glanced upward, his voice quieter now. I'm not standing here because I earned this. I'm here because grace is stronger than shame, because forgiveness is real, and because a man who spent his whole life running can still stop, turn around, and walk back. He looked out over the crowd, searching their eyes. If there's someone you need to call, do it. If there's a letter you've been afraid to write, write it if the words are stuck in your throat. I'm sorry. I forgive you. I love you. Say them trembling. Say them late. Say them anyway. A long silence. Follow the kind that doesn't ask for applause. And slowly people began to rise, not out of protocol, out of prayer. And the applause that followed wasn't loud, it was deep. It rose like a sigh from the soul. Thomas stepped down from the stage and didn't return to his seat. Instead, he walked into the crowd. He sat beside a young woman who had been crying quietly. She looked at him and whispered, I haven't spoken to my father in 22 years. Thomas nodded gently, took her hand, and said, maybe today is your day. Across the garden, the confessional lines lengthened. People knelt under fig trees, on grass, on stones. Some wrote letters and folded them into envelopes with shaking fingers. Others sat together for the first time in years, mothers and sons, sisters and brothers, just sitting, not yet speaking. But close again, Cardinal Toretti watched from a distance, writing in a small black notebook. There were no flames today, no tongues of fire, but I saw hearts burning again, and that is miracle enough. Later in the Afternoon, Pope Leo XIV arrived not in gold or red, but in a simple white cassock and sandals. He didn't stand at the pulpit. He sat among the people on a wooden bench. When he finally rose to speak, he spoke not as ruler, but as witness today. He said, "You have reminded the world that the kingdom of God is not built with stone, but with mercy, that heaven draws near not through thrones, but through tears." He turned toward the crowd. "My first vocation is not to be a pope," he said. "It is to be a son, a brother, a shepherd, and all three begin with mercy." He raised his hand and blessed the people. "May you be given the courage to forgive and the humility to receive forgiveness, and may today not be a memory, but a beginning." As the sun began to lower behind the dome of St. Peter's, the Vatican gardens remained full not of noise, but of life. Children chased doves to the paths. Elderly women sat hand in hand with daughters they had not seen in years. Fathers wrote down words they had never dared speak, and Thomas Post stood near the fountain, his eyes filled with quiet peace. He had never known. He had spoken not as a saint, but as a sinner who came home, and the world had. Listen to morning after the day of reconciliation. A soft rain blanketed the hills near Castel Gandolfo, where a small villa nestled quietly beneath the olive trees. The garden shimmered with dew. Birds moved gently across the rooftops. Inside the villa, Thomas Post sat at a wooden desk. Beside a window, the sound of rain mingling with the scratching of his pen across a page. The letter he was writing was not for publication. It was not addressed to the Vatican or even to his son. It began simply to the doors. They stood in silence on the porch as the sun dipped behind the hills, and that quiet Thomas whispered something he had been thinking for weeks. "I may have begun your life, Robert, but you gave mine back." Robert placed his hand on his father's shoulder. "We gave it back to each other. Winter gave way to spring quietly in Castel Gandolfo. The hills beyond the villa were touched with green again. Olive trees stirred in the breeze, and birds returned to perch on the stone walls of the chapel. It was the season of new beginnings, slow, gentle, almost unnoticed by the world, but unmistakable to those who had been waiting inside the villa. Thomas Prevost's health had begun to fade. He had grown weaker over the last few weeks. The walks were shorter, the breathing slower. Still, each morning he dressed himself carefully, opened the window to the garden, and sat with his rosary in hand. The cross from the Padre Ferretti group hung around his neck, resting over his heart like a quiet promise on the evening of March 24th. The Pope arrived at his father's bedside. There were no cameras, no Vatican announcements, just a son coming to see his father. Robert sat beside him, took his hand, and prayed the rosary aloud. They didn't speak much. The words had already been said. The silence between them was not empty. It was full, rich with everything they had found. Again, Thomas opened his eyes briefly and whispered, "I thought I lost you forever." Robert smiled through tears. "You never lost me. You just didn't know I was waiting." At dawn the next morning, Thomas Post passed into eternal rest. His death was not marked by public mourning. There was no state funeral. The Pope insisted on a small service held in the quiet chapel behind the villa, surrounded only by those who had walked with Thomas. In his final years, the Padre Ferretti group came. So did the local parish priest, a few members of the Vatican staff, and Cardinal Toretti, who stood near the back of the chapel with his head bowed. Robert gave the homily himself. "My father taught me many things in his final years." He began, his voice steady though his hands trembled. "But the greatest lesson he gave me was this: love, when rooted in mercy, does not die. It transforms, it resurrects." He paused and looked out at the small gathering. "My father once ran from his family. He once believed the wound he caused could never be healed, but grace had other plans, and because of that grace, a second embrace was possible." They laid Thomas to rest beneath an olive tree just behind the chapel. The stone marker was simple, no titles, no fanfare, just 5 words: Thomas Prevost, Father forgiven, free each spring. White leaves began to bloom beside the grave. No one planted them, no gardener admitted attending them, but every year, without fail, they appeared small, fragrant, impossibly bright. The locals began calling them Fiori del Ritorno, flowers of return back. And Rome, the Pope continued his mission. The Fratelli mission expanded into dozens of countries, sending trained priests, sisters, and lay leaders into communities divided by generations of silence. They didn't arrive with programs. They arrived with presence, listening, sitting, helping people speak the unspeakable. Robert gave a speech the following Pentecost. The Holy Spirit, he said, does not always come in fire. Sometimes he arrives in the form of a letter, a knock at the door, a tear. Reconciliation is not a doctrine to be memorized, is a door to be opened, and every time we open that door, we let Christ walk through again. The story of Thomas' post continued to ripple outward as book The Second Embrace was translated into more than 20 languages. In nursing homes, elderly men read it with trembling hands and asked their sons to visit in prisons. Men circled together and read passages aloud in schools. Teenagers wrote reconciliation letters as assignments, some of which led to reunions more powerful than any test score. One day a letter arrived from Boston, addressed to Robert. It was from a young woman named Angela. "My name is Angela." It read, "I'm the daughter of the man your father helped in the Café Gabriel. He never told me what he was going through, but one day he showed up at my door with tears in his eyes and a book in his hand. He said he wanted to start over, that he didn't know how, but he was willing now. He reads to my little girl. They eat cookies together every Sunday. I just want to say, thank you. Your father gave me mine back." Robert read it slowly, then folded the letter and placed it in the small cedar box where he kept his most sacred keepsakes, his mother's rosary, a photo of his ordination. And now, that night, he lit a candle in his private chapel, not for a feast day, not for a saint, but for a man who had once believed he was too far gone. He whispered, "Thank you, Papa." The light flickered, casting shadows on the wall. He stayed in the chapel a long time, not praying aloud, not speaking, just remembering. And somewhere in quiet corners across the world, 1,000 other candles were lit by fathers trying again, by sons picking up the phone, by daughters writing what they've been too afraid to say. They lit them in kitchens and churches and by hospital beds, and each one whispered the same truth. It is not too late. The next morning, Robert returned to the garden in Castel Gandolfo. The leaves were blooming again. He knelt by his father's grave and placed a fresh white rose on the stone. "We're still walking," he said softly, one step at a time, and somewhere beyond the veil, a father who had once run now stood, waiting not in shame but in peace, waiting for his son's next step, and smiling. "Thank you for staying with us and opening your heart to this journey. It means more than words can say. As you listen, may your soul be uplifted, and your day filled with grace and peace from the Lord and our beloved Pope Leo XIV. The next part of the story holds something truly special, and we can't wait to share it with you. If this message touches you, please subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and let us know. You're walking this path with us. Your presence here is a true blessing.